Testament narrative text. I made a couple of recommendations based on the options I usually give students to choose from. Joseph narrative, crossing the miraculous Red Sea crossing by the Israelites, Exodus 13 and 14. The Ehud Eglon narrative in Judges 3:12 through 30. There are particular challenges and opportunities that surface with those passages. And that's usually why I ask students to choose from one of those three. So if you want to fit within what I usually do in this class, that's what I usually do. However, I'm also allowing you the freedom on this first one to choose any other Old Testament narrative passage if you wish, since we didn't make it through very many genre categories on that first go-round. I do want you to address a narrative text in this first sermon because so much of the Old Testament scriptures is in the narrative genre. So you really need experience working with that at an advanced undergraduate level. The second of your two Old Testament passages can be from any of the Old Testament categories that we're discussing together. And in the New Testament, it's, your first one's really going to need to be from the Gospels, because that's what we're going to get covered, and you just need to do one of your New Testament ones from the Gospels. The second will be from the non-gospel material. These are your written sermon summaries. Your recorded preached sermon can be either Old Testament or New Testament, but not from the same genre categories as your written sermons. So again, you're preparing 5 sermons in some form, 2 Old Testament, 2 New Testament, but then you're preached with them. You want to work on Old Testament stuff? Great, preach from that. You want to do New Testament stuff? Great, preach from that. You can, one word of clarification on the New Testament text. You can write a sermon on the parables and preach one from the miracles. You can do, in other words, a written sermon and a preached sermon from the Gospels, but it can't be from the same literature category within the Gospels.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I would think that'd be fairly obvious, but since I said you had to do a written sermon within the Gospels, I wanted to make sure I was clear enough about that. Because we've got all these subcategories, parables, miracles, other stuff. All right, is that all clear enough? Let me walk through that and give you some text choices within the other genre categories. So you might want to go ahead and write these down in yourself. Within the poetry category, in which we're going to especially concentrate on the Psalms. Psalm 8, Psalm 32, Psalm 136. Eight, 32, 136. Now, some of you may remember I preached in chapel this fall on Psalm 32. I did that knowing that I was going to be teaching this class in the spring. And hoping some of you would have been there so I could use it as a case study. How many of you were there? Were any of you not there? Oh, you're breaking my heart right now. You're trying to remember whether or not you were here when I preached in chapel.
Oh, no, I remember.
Breaking my heart.
Yeah.
Oh, you remember?
I was like, you were there.
Brother Rutherford, were you there?
I don't think I was. I think I was sick that day. I remember that. I was like, Children's Chapel I missed because I was sick.
That's probably what made you sick when you were having to miss my Sunday in chapel, isn't that right?
That was like,
So if you're going to preach from Psalm 32, don't just do what I did.
Well, yeah. You're kind of hard, man. I don't have the same stories or illustrations that you had. So.
That wasn't a very illustration-heavy sermon.
Really, one guy was just like,
Yeah, that's true. All right. Thank you for remembering that.
Fitbit.
Fitbit.
Yeah, I remember.
All right. What's that?
I was just remembering your sermon.
Oh, okay. Old Testament wisdom. Let's talk about Old Testament wisdom for a moment. The choices I'm going to give you. Proverbs 8 and 9. Or something from the book of Ecclesiastes. All or part. So you can pick a passage in Ecclesiastes, or you can do a book sermon on Ecclesiastes. If you take that choice. Old Testament prophecy. One option is Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. A second option is the book of Malachi, all or part. Parables. Your options are Matthew 13, all or part. Luke 15, all or part. Preaching from the miracles. Here are your options. Matthew chapter. Make sure I get this right. Let me rephrase that. No, I'm not going to give you Matthew. Give you Matthew options on the other. Mark chapter 9. Verses 14 through 29. John chapter 9. What the heck, I was throwing a third one. Luke 13, 10 through 17. Make sure I got this. of Acts. I'm going to give you two options in the book of Acts. One of them is Acts chapter 2, all or part. The other is Acts chapter 7. And epistles, Romans 3 verses 21 through 26. Ephesians 4 verses 1 through 6.
What's the Romans one again?
Romans 3, 21 through 26.
Ephesians, sorry.
Ephesians 4 verses 1 through 6. Book of Revelation, chapter 11. Or anything from chapters 21 and 22. So, those are options you can choose from for the rest of your sermon assignments. All right. Today, we are going to begin our journey through the rest of the Old Testament genre categories. So we're going to begin with Old Testament poetry. However, I do want to take a moment to clean up any issues that may remain from our first class meeting together, discussion of Old Testament narrative and legal material, work that you may have done thus far on your one-year sermon plan. Remember, a lot of work for this class is kind of backloaded. So you don't want to wait till the very end to start working on stuff in here, because it may get you late, and I don't want it to get you late. So any things that have come up that you just wanted to talk about, that have come up in your thinking since we were first together, in relationship to the yearly sermon plan, or in relationship to preaching from Old Testament narrative material or legal material. Anything at all that you want to discuss. Trying to give you the freedom to help set the agenda here. Help me as a co-architect, a co-creator of this class. Do you have anything? All right. If not, let's start to move into our discussion of Old Testament poetry material. As we do so, let me begin with this observation. Like we saw with narrative, poetry as a genre is present in a number of the other genres that we're talking about. Remember how we talked about with narrative, that you talk about Old Testament narrative genre and you think certain books. You think of a lot of the early books in the Old Testament as falling into the genre category. You think about Genesis. You think about the first half of Exodus. You think about the book of Numbers. You think about Joshua and Judges. you think about the United Monarchy period in Israel. You think about the divided kingdom era. You think about the reunification of that kingdom. But as you're doing so, you tend to think about specific books. So to move into those latter categories, you tend to think in terms of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. You don't really think about Jeremiah when you think about narrative material, because we put him in the prophetic category. And yet, when you start into the early chapters of Jeremiah, you realize that a lot of Jeremiah is narrative. So to talk about narrative actually involves all kinds of stuff, and yet, at times we distinguish it for convenience, talk about it in a more narrow way. Well, the same's true of poetry. Old Testament